July 12, 1943, 0447 hours. Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Through the vision ports of their Panzer IV, Oberfeldwebel Werner Hoffmann and his crew heard it before they saw it. A sound like distant thunder rolling across the steppe, except the sky was clear. The ground began to vibrate. Dust rose on the horizon in a line stretching as far as the eye could see. Then, as dawn broke across the wheat fields of the Kursk salient, they witnessed something no German tanker had ever seen. 500 Soviet T-34 tanks emerging from the morning mist in waves, charging directly toward their positions at full speed. The Russians weren't attempting maneuver. They weren't seeking cover. They were coming straight at the Germans in a massive armored avalanche that would transform tank warfare forever and shatter every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about Soviet capabilities. The confidence of the German tank crews on the morning of July 12, 1943, was built on 2 years of seemingly unbreakable tactical superiority. Since Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, German armored units had achieved kill ratios that seemed to confirm their technical and tactical dominance. At Brody Dubno in June 1941, approximately 750 German tanks had destroyed over 2,800 Soviet tanks in what remained the largest tank battle in history until Kursk. At Racine, a single German Tiger tank had held off an entire Soviet tank brigade for a full day. The mathematics appeared irrefutable. According to Wehrmacht records compiled by Heeresgruppe Süd, German tank units were achieving average kill ratios of 10-to-1 against Soviet armor. Panzer crews had developed what intelligence officers called Ostfront Übermut, Eastern Front overconfidence. They had reason for this attitude. The Soviet T-34, despite its excellent design, had been deployed with poorly trained crews using outdated tactical doctrine. German after-action reports from 1941-1942 documented Soviet tanks attacking in predictable linear formations, failing to use terrain, and communicating poorly due to most T-34s lacking radios. Lieutenant General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army at Kursk, had personally reviewed intelligence assessments indicating Soviet tank forces remained tactically inferior despite growing numbers. German intelligence estimated Soviet tank strength at approximately 5,000 vehicles in the Kursk salient, but Wehrmacht planners believed quality would triumph over quantity as it had consistently since 1941. The German plan for Operation Citadel, the offensive to pinch off the Kursk salient, relied on technological superiority embodied in new weapons. The Tiger I heavy tank, mounting the devastating 88mm KWK-36 gun, could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while remaining invulnerable to most Soviet weapons beyond 500 meters. The new Panther medium tank, rushed into service specifically for Citadel, combined heavy armor with mobility and mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of penetrating any Soviet armor at combat ranges. Tactical doctrine reinforced technological confidence. German tank crews trained extensively in Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, that emphasized superior positioning, crew coordination, and combined arms integration. Each German tank had a radio, allowing unprecedented tactical flexibility. Crews underwent rigorous training programs lasting months compared to the weeks Soviet crews typically received. On the evening of July 11, 1943, Oberfeldwebel Hoffmann's Panzer IV was positioned with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps southeast of Prokhorovka. The crew had been briefed that Soviet forces were withdrawing, that resistance would be moderate, and that the objective, the small railway town of Prokhorovka, would fall within 48 hours. Intelligence maps showed expected defensive positions oriented toward traditional defense-in-depth tactics. What German intelligence had failed to detect was a complete transformation in Soviet operational doctrine and a massive concentration of armor unprecedented in military history. While German commanders expected to face defensive positions, Soviet commanders had prepared something entirely different. A counterattack of such scale and ferocity that it would redefine armored warfare.
What the Germans didn't know, couldn't know, was that the Red Army they faced in July 1943 bore little resemblance to the force they had decimated in 1941. The transformation had been systematic, comprehensive, and deliberately concealed. In underground factories beyond the Ural Mountains, Soviet industry had achieved production miracles that German intelligence considered impossible. The Tankrograd complex at Chelyabinsk alone was producing over 1,000 T-34 tanks monthly by mid-1943, more than Germany's entire monthly tank production. But numbers alone didn't explain what was coming. The Soviet General Staff, under the direction of General Georgy Zhukov and Operations Chief General Alexander Vasilevsky, had completely revised armored warfare doctrine based on 2 years of devastating defeats. The new doctrine, formalized in Red Army Field Regulations of 1942, emphasized mass, shock action, and aggressive maneuver, principles that contradicted the defensive thinking that had characterized earlier Soviet operations. The 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, represented the new Soviet approach. Created in February 1943 specifically for offensive operations, it consisted of approximately 850 tanks and self-propelled guns organized into 2 corps, the 18th Tank Corps and 29th Tank Corps. These weren't the disorganized tank brigades of 1941. They were combined arms formations, integrating armor, infantry, artillery, and air support with sophisticated command and control. Rotmistrov himself embodied the new Soviet tanker. At 42 years old, he had survived the purges, fought through the disasters of 1941, and emerged as one of the Red Army's most aggressive armor commanders. On July 11th, in his command post near Prokhorovka, Rotmistrov received orders directly from Marshal Vasilevsky. The 5th Guards Tank Army would counterattack on July 12th with a single objective: smash through German armor concentrations regardless of cost. The tactical plan was revolutionary in its simplicity and brutality. Soviet tanks would attack at maximum speed in multiple waves, closing the range to German positions as rapidly as possible. This tactic, which Soviet planners called the ram attack, was designed to negate German advantages in long-range gunnery and superior optics. At close range, under 500 meters, the T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate most German armor, and superior Soviet numbers would overwhelm German tactical skill. Soviet preparations proceeded through the night of July 11th-12th with strict radio silence. Approximately 500 tanks from the 18th and 29th Tank Corps, plus supporting units, moved into assault positions under cover of darkness. The formations were massive. Company after company of T-34s organized in lines stretching kilometers across the steppe. Each tank crew had received identical orders: attack at full speed towards German positions, close to minimum range, engage at point-blank distance. The T-34s themselves had evolved since 1941. While the basic design remained, manufacturing quality had improved dramatically. Crews were better trained, and critically, more tanks now carried radios, enabling tactical coordination impossible in earlier battles. The crews manning these tanks weren't the barely trained conscripts of 1941. Many were veterans who had survived the retreat to Moscow, the defense of Stalingrad, and the spring battles of 1943. They knew German tanks could kill them at long range. Their orders to close the distance at maximum speed acknowledged this reality and sought to neutralize it through sheer audacity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 0447 hours, July 12th, 1943. The first indication came not through vision, but through the earth itself. Oberfeldwebel Hoffmann, positioned in his Panzer IV turret, felt vibrations through the steel hull that seemed impossible. His gunner, Unteroffizier Kurt Bauer, reported movement on the horizon, dust clouds rising in the pre-dawn light. Within seconds, the dust resolved into shapes, then into vehicles, then into an armored mass that defied comprehension. Soviet T-34 tanks emerged from the morning mist in formation after formation, stretching across a front approximately 4 kilometers wide. German observers estimated later that the initial assault wave contained over 200 tanks, with subsequent waves visible behind. They weren't maneuvering for position or seeking hull-down firing positions. They were charging at full speed, approximately 55 kilometers per hour, directly toward German lines. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, a loader in a nearby Panzer IV, later described the moment in his diary. It was like watching the ocean itself turn into metal and come toward you. There was no end to them. The sound, the sound of 500 engines at full throttle. It drowned out everything, even our own engine. For the first time since France, I felt fear. German tanks opened fire at maximum range, approximately 1,800 to 2,000 meters for Tigers, 1,200 to 1,500 meters for Panzer IVs. The 88mm guns of the Tigers proved devastatingly effective. The first salvo from Schwerer Panzer 503 destroyed 7 T-34s in under a minute. Shells struck Soviet tanks, penetrating frontal armor and detonating ammunition. T-34s exploded, their turrets blown completely off their hulls. Others burst into flames, crews bailing out into the wheat fields. But the Soviet advance didn't slow. Damaged tanks were bypassed by those behind. When a T-34 was hit and stopped, the tank following it simply drove around the wreckage and continued forward. German gunners, trained to expect Soviet formations to falter under accurate fire, found themselves facing an enemy that accepted casualties as the price of closing range. The mathematics of the engagement began shifting rapidly. A Tiger could fire approximately 6 aimed shots per minute. Even with perfect accuracy, a single Tiger engaging the Soviet advance could destroy perhaps 30 tanks before being overrun. But the Soviets were attacking with hundreds. Panzer IVs, with less powerful 75mm guns, needed closer range for guaranteed penetration. But closing that range meant entering the effective engagement envelope of Soviet 76mm guns. At 0453 hours, the first Soviet tanks reached 1,000 meters. At this range, concentrated fire from multiple T-34s could threaten even Tigers. The Soviet tactic became clear: swarm German tanks with multiple targets simultaneously, forcing them to divide fire. When one T-34 died, 2 more were already firing. By 0456 hours, the lead Soviet elements had closed to 800 meters. German radio nets filled with urgent communications as crew commanders realized the scope of the attack. Hauptmann Friedrich Lehmann, commanding a company of Panzer IVs, transmitted, "Request immediate support, enemy armor in regiment strength, possibly division strength. They're not stopping. Repeat, they are not stopping." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
05:02 a.m. The Soviet assault waves reached 500 meters, the range at which the entire character of the battle transformed. At this distance, the T-34's 76mm F-34 gun could reliably penetrate the frontal armor of Panzer IVs and the side armor of Panthers. More critically,
German advantages in optics, range-finding, and crew training diminished when tanks were fighting at distances where missing became nearly impossible. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Individual tank duels merged into a massive melee stretching across several square kilometers of steppe. Oberfeldwebel-Hoffmann's Panzer IV engaged a T-34 at 400 meters, scoring a hit that failed to penetrate the sloped frontal armor. The Soviet tank returned fire immediately. The shell struck Hoffmann's turret, penetrating the side armor and killing his gunner instantly. Hoffmann ordered his driver to reverse while his loader desperately tried to serve the main gun alone. Around him, the carefully organized German defensive position disintegrated. Soviet tanks were everywhere, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The radio net became unusable. Too many transmissions, too much panic, too many requests for support that couldn't be provided. Crews that had trained together for months found themselves fighting isolated actions, unable to coordinate with neighboring vehicles. SS Sturmbannführer Rudolf Enseling, demanding a battalion of Panthers from the Leibstandarte division, attempted to organize a counterattack. His Panthers, theoretically superior to any Soviet tank, found themselves fighting at ranges where their advantages meant nothing. A Panther engaged a T-34 at 200 meters, destroying it with a single shot. Before the crew could acquire another target, two more T-34s appeared from a smoke cloud, firing simultaneously. One shell penetrated the Panther's side armor. The second struck the turret ring, jamming the turret. The Soviet tactic of accepting horrendous casualties to close range was proving devastatingly effective. German after-action reports estimated that by 05:15 a.m., approximately 150 Soviet tanks had been destroyed, but over 300 remained in action, many now intermixed with German positions. Traditional tactics became impossible. A Tiger couldn't use its superior range when Soviet tanks were within 100 meters. A Panther's sloped armor meant nothing when T-34s were shooting at side and rear aspects. Unteroffizier Bauer, having assumed the gunner position in Hoffmann's damaged Panzer IV, described the horror. Everywhere you looked, there were T-34s. You'd destroy one, and before you could traverse, another was beside you. We hit 3 Soviet tanks in maybe 2 minutes, but there were always more. Always more. Our loader was crying. I don't blame him. I wanted to cry too. The close-range fighting created nightmarish conditions. Burning tanks from both sides turned the battlefield into a maze of fire and smoke. Visibility dropped to hundreds of meters in some areas. Crews bailed out of destroyed vehicles only to be caught in crossfire or crushed by advancing tanks. The wheat fields that had covered the steppe that morning were now churned mud and burning stubble. At 05:20 a.m., a second Soviet wave, approximately 150 fresh tanks from reserve formations, entered the battle. They had learned from the first wave, using the smoke and chaos to approach even closer before engaging.
05:45 hours. The German defensive line, which had existed as a coherent formation at dawn, no longer existed. What remained were isolated pockets of resistance, individual tanks or small groups fighting desperate actions while surrounded by Soviet armor. The psychological transformation was complete. German crews that had entered battle confident in their superiority now fought purely for survival. Oberfeldwebel-Hoffmann's Panzer IV, damaged and with half its crew dead or wounded, attempted to withdraw toward German lines. The journey became a nightmare navigation through a battlefield completely controlled by Soviet forces. Every direction revealed T-34s, hunting, firing, advancing. Hoffmann's driver, Gefreiter Otto Reinhardt, maneuvered desperately between burning wrecks and shell craters while the remaining crew searched for an escape route. The radio brought fragmentary reports of similar situations across the battlefield. Tiger tanks, previously considered nearly invulnerable, were being destroyed by coordinated attacks from multiple T-34s. One Tiger from Schwere Panzer Abteilung 503 reported destroying 11 Soviet tanks before a T-34 maneuvered to its rear and fired into the engine deck, setting the Tiger ablaze. The crew survived, but the tank, worth 20 T-34s in German calculations, was lost. Soviet losses were staggering by any conventional military standard. Post-battle analysis indicated approximately 300 T-34 tanks destroyed or disabled by 0600 hours, nearly 60% of the attacking force. In previous battles, such casualties would have stopped any assault. But Soviet commanders had calculated differently. They had accepted these losses as the price of destroying German armored striking power, and they had brought enough tanks to absorb the casualties and continue attacking. The mathematics that had favored Germany for 2 years had reversed. A German tank crew might destroy 3, 4, even 5 Soviet tanks and still die when the 6th tank fired from an unexpected angle. Superior training and technology meant nothing when overwhelmed by numbers at close range. The kill ratios that had defined German confidence became irrelevant when Soviet production could replace losses faster than Germany could achieve them. By 0600 hours, the German command structure began acknowledging reality. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, one of Germany's most decorated tank commanders, transmitted an assessment that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Soviet armor attack has penetrated defensive positions, unable to restore line. Request permission to withdraw surviving units. The request marked a psychological watershed. German tank forces on the Eastern Front had attacked, defended, and maneuvered, but they had never before acknowledged that Soviet armor could force German withdrawal through sheer combat power. The message confirmed what individual crews across the battlefield already knew. The Red Army they faced in July 1943 was fundamentally different from the army they had crushed in 1941. Hoffmann's Panzer IV reached German infantry positions at 06:15 hours. Of his original crew of 5, 2 were dead and 1 was wounded. The tank itself was damaged beyond field repair. Around him, other German tanks arrived in various states of damage, crews shaken and depleted. Looking back toward Prokhorovka, the steppe was covered with burning vehicles, German and Soviet alike, creating a vision of industrial hell. The battle for Prokhorovka officially ended by early afternoon on July 12th, though sporadic fighting continued for days. The casualty figures told the story that German commanders struggled to comprehend. Soviet losses were catastrophic by traditional standards, approximately 400 to 500 tanks destroyed or damaged, representing roughly 60% of attacking forces. Crew casualties numbered in the thousands. By conventional military wisdom, the Soviets had suffered a devastating defeat. But the Germans had lost something more precious than tanks. They had lost their psychological advantage. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which entered battle with approximately 300 tanks, could field fewer than 150 operational vehicles by July 13th. More significantly, veteran crews, the experienced tankers who formed the core of German armored effectiveness, had been killed or wounded in numbers that couldn't be quickly replaced. Germany's training infrastructure couldn't produce experienced tank crews at the rate Soviet factories produced tanks. In his bunker headquarters, Hitler received reports of the Prokhorovka engagement with growing alarm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, requested reinforcements to continue Operation Citadel. Hitler refused. On July 13th, he ordered the offensive suspended, the first time a major German offensive had been called off due to enemy action rather than weather or logistics. The decision acknowledged a new strategic reality. Germany could no longer trade casualties with the Soviet Union and expect to win. German tank crews who survived Prokhorovka were fundamentally changed. Unteroffizier Bauer, who assumed command of Hoffmann's Panzer IV after his commander was wounded, wrote in a letter that reached German censors, "We always knew the Russians were brave, but we thought our skill and our tanks made the difference. At Prokhorovka, I learned that bravery plus enough tanks equals victory, regardless of skill. We destroyed so many of them, so many, and it didn't matter. There were always more." The battle's implications extended far beyond immediate casualties.
Soviet commanders, particularly Rotmistrov, had demonstrated that mass armor attacks could overwhelm German defensive positions despite horrific losses. The tactic would be refined and repeated in every major Soviet offensive through 1945. German forces would face similar mass tank attacks at Kursk and Cherkasy during Operation Bagration and in the final drives into Germany itself. Post-war analysis by both Soviet and German military historians identified Prokhorovka as a turning point in armored warfare doctrine. The Soviets had proven that numerical superiority, combined with aggressive tactics accepting high casualties, could neutralize German technical and tactical advantages. German General Friedrich von Mellenthin, analyzing the battle in his memoirs, concluded, "At Prokhorovka, we learned that we could destroy Soviet tanks at a ratio of 3-to-1 or even 5-to-1 and still lose the battle. They had more tanks than we had shells." For the common German tanker, Prokhorovka destroyed the illusion of invincibility that had sustained morale since 1941. Every subsequent battle carried the knowledge that Soviet armor could appear in overwhelming numbers and attack with fanatical determination. The psychological warfare was as complete as the tactical defeat.
The broader implications of Prokhorovka rippled through both German and Soviet military structures for the remainder of the war. For the Wehrmacht, the battle marked the end of offensive capability on the Eastern Front. After July 1943, German forces would fight almost exclusively defensive operations, attempting to delay inevitable defeat rather than achieve victory. The realization that Soviet industrial capacity could overwhelm German tactical skill fundamentally altered strategic planning. Soviet military doctrine evolved directly from Prokhorovka's lessons. Marshal Zhukov incorporated mass tank attacks into operational planning for every subsequent major offensive. During Operation Bagration in June 1944, Soviet forces deployed over 5,000 tanks against Army Group Center, overwhelming German defenses through sheer numerical superiority combined with improved tactical coordination. The pattern established at Prokhorovka, accept heavy casualties to close range and overwhelm enemy positions, became Soviet operational doctrine through war's end. For individual German tank crews, every battle after Prokhorovka carried the psychological burden of knowing they faced an enemy that wouldn't break regardless of casualties inflicted. Panzer crews that had once hunted Soviet tanks now found themselves hunted by numerically superior forces. The transformation from predator to prey was psychologically devastating for men trained to believe in their inherent superiority. The technological response proved inadequate. Germany developed heavier tanks, the Tiger II, the Jagdtiger, the Maus, seeking to restore technical dominance. But these vehicles, while formidable individually, consumed resources Germany couldn't spare and appeared in numbers too small to affect strategic outcomes. Soviet factories continued producing T-34s by the thousands, each one adequate for its role in mass attacks that German heavy tanks couldn't prevent. Wehrmacht veterans who survived to write memoirs consistently identified Prokhorovka as the moment they knew Germany would lose the war. The mathematics were inescapable. Soviet factories could produce more tanks than German crews could destroy, and Soviet willingness to accept casualties exceeded Germany's ability to inflict them. Otto Karius, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, wrote, "After Kursk, we knew in our hearts, we could still win battles, but we couldn't win the war. The Russians would keep coming, and we would eventually run out of fuel, ammunition, or men." The final accounting of Prokhorovka remains debated by historians, but the strategic outcome is clear. Operation Citadel failed. Germany never again launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces took the initiative and never relinquished it. The 500 Soviet tanks that charged across the steppe on July 12, 1943, demonstrated a fundamental truth of industrial warfare.
Sufficient quantity employed with sufficient aggression overcomes quality when the numerical disparity becomes overwhelming. Today, the fields around Prokhorovka contain memorials to both sides. The largest monument depicts a Soviet T-34 tank turret pointed west towards Germany, commemorating the moment when Soviet armor proved it could defeat the Wehrmacht through sheer determination and numbers. For the German tank crews who witnessed 500 Soviet tanks rolling across the steppe that July morning, the memory remained vivid for the rest of their lives. The sound of massed engines, the sight of endless armor advancing despite casualties, and the realization that technological superiority meant nothing against an enemy with unlimited will and industrial capacity to match. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.